There are some names that just echo through history. Stories told and retold more than 1,000 years. One of those names is Husayn Mansur Al-Hallaj. His life was a spiritual firestorm, and his death, well, that became a legend. Anal Haq. In Arabic, that means I am the truth, or I am the God. And just for saying these three words, Hallaj was publicly arrested, thrown in prison for 9 years, and then condemned, tortured, and finally executed in Baghdad in the year 922. Now, to his accusers, this was pure blasphemy. I mean, a man claiming to be God himself, but for centuries of poets, mystics, and rebels, it meant something completely different. That brings us to the big mystery. What did he actually mean? To figure this out, we have got to travel back in time into his world. So, let's dive in. Who exactly was this man behind these world-changing words? Hallaj's life was one of constant searching. He was born around 858 in Persia, but he was drawn to Baghdad, the absolute center of the Islamic Empire at the time, to study the mystical path of Sufism. But he couldn't sit still. He traveled everywhere, through Persia, into Turkestan, all the way to India, picking up followers and enemies along the way. Eventually, his influence got so big that the authorities saw him as a threat, which led to his arrest in 913, and then, 9 years later, his execution. To really get Hallaj, you have to picture the world he was in. 10th century Sufism was this incredible spiritual movement. It was basically a pushback against the empire's growing obsession with wealth and power. It called people to something deeper, inner purity, and a direct personal experience of God. But this was seen a pretty dangerous path. Most mystics believed these deep truths should be kept secret, and you can bet the political and religious powers that be were always watching them with a lot of suspicion. And that context is absolutely crucial, because it brings us right back to the heart of the whole thing, the meaning of Anal Haq. Okay, before we go any further, we need to talk about a concept called Tawheed. This is the absolute bedrock of Islam. It's the idea of divine unity. It means that God is the one, single, absolute reality. Everything else exists, sure, but God is the only ultimate truth. And this is where the fatal misunderstanding happened. His accusers claimed he said, Ana illah, I am God. That's a claim to be divine, the biggest blasphemy you can imagine. But he never said that. He said, An-al-Haq, I am the creative truth. And for him, this wasn't about building himself up. It was the exact opposite. It was a statement of total self-annihilation. It meant that his little individual self, his ego, had completely dissolved into the only thing that's truly real, God. A later Sufi master, Jami, just put it so perfectly. He compared Hallaj with the pharaoh, who also famously declared, I am. Jami wrote, Pharaoh saw only himself and lost God. Mansur, that's Hallaj, saw only God and lost himself. Do you see the difference? One eye is all ego, and it leads to ruin. The other eye comes from being so completely absorbed in the divine that you disappear. So how does someone lose themselves like that? Well, Hallaj himself gave us one of the best metaphors ever for this journey, the moth and the flame. So step 1, the moth sees the candle's light from far away. That's knowing about God in your head. Step 2, it gets closer and feels the heat of the flame. That's a direct personal experience of God. And finally, step 3, the moth, just consumed by love, dives right into the flame and becomes one with it. That last stage is what Sufis call fana, the complete extinction of the self in God. And that is the state Hallaj was in when he cried out, So, which was he? A heretic who got what he deserved? Or a saint who was completely misunderstood? I mean, if this was all some deep mystical experience, how does it end so badly? Why was he considered so incredibly dangerous? Well, the truth is, it's complicated. Hallaj was a man of paradoxes. His teachings were deep and, well, not for everyone. A lot of people, including other Sufis, thought he was revealing spiritual secrets to the public that they just weren't ready for. The authorities were also paranoid he was stirring up political trouble, maybe even had ties to a rebel group. And maybe the strangest part of all? Hallaj ran toward suffering. He didn't see it as a punishment, but as a sign of God's passionate love. So, over the centuries, people have tried to fit Hallaj into all kinds of boxes. The authorities in his day, they saw a blasphemer, plain and simple. Later on, some scholars labeled him a pantheist. Others even tried to argue he was secretly a Christian. But for the great poets like Rumi and Attar, he was something else entirely. For them, he was the ultimate martyr of divine love, a soul so on fire for God that nothing else was left. And this radical idea of embracing martyrdom, you can hear it in his own words. He wasn't some victim being dragged to his death. From his point of view, he was running toward it. He reportedly yelled out to the crowds, "Kill me, my trustworthy friends, for in my killing is my life." For him, death wasn't an end. It was the final, perfect union with the God he'd been chasing his whole life. So what happens after an execution like that? What is the legacy of a man who dies for his beliefs? The stories about his execution are just breathtaking. As they brought him out to be killed, he didn't curse anyone. He prayed for them. He actually prayed for the very people who sentenced him, asking God to forgive them because in their own way, they were just trying to defend their faith. There is this one famous story from that day that says it all. The crowd starts throwing stones at him and he's completely silent. But then, his old friend, another Sufi master named Shibli, throws a single soft rose. He had to do something to blend in, and it's only then that Hallaj cries out in pain. When they asked him why, he supposedly explained that the stones came from people who were ignorant. They didn't know what they were doing. But the rose came from someone who knew better. His death wasn't the end, not by a long shot. In a lot of ways, it was a beginning. For more than 1,000 years, Hallaj has been this powerful symbol. For Sufi mystics, he's the ultimate lover of God. For poets writing in Persian, Urdu, and Turkish, he's the go-to metaphor for a soul that's just consumed by passion. And even today, his story is used by social reformers and political dissidents who see him as a model for speaking truth to power no matter what it costs. At the end of the day, story of Hallaj forces us to look at those blurry lines between faith and heresy, between madness and sainthood. And it leaves us with a question that echoes all the way from the 10th century to right now. If a person like Hallaj showed up today, someone who totally shattered our conventions and claimed to have a direct line to the divine, what would we do? Would we condemn him as a heretic, or would we have the courage to see him as a saint?
آن کس که از او چرخ و هوا